Thank you, Rebecca. I'm bringing you greetings from the Textile Center where I'm on the board. The end of May last year, right after George Floyd was murdered, Dr. Carolyn Mazzalumi was propelled into action. She is an internationally known fiber artist and founder of the uh, Women of Color Quilters Network. She is also on the National Artists Advisory Council of the Textile Center in Minnesota. She and Carl Reichert conferred. Carl is the executive director of the Textile Center. And the two of them devised a series of quilts in reaction to the violence, the incarceration, and the deaths of Black Americans around the country. They hope to have 7 quilt exhibits to be displayed in venues around the Twin Cities, some by nationally recognized Black quilters, and a couple by quilters responding to a call for entry that Carolyn issued and then curated. And Carolyn got very busy finding those exhibits. Carl got busy too, and I also helped with the process of finding possible venues for the quilts. This was early June, and we thought everything would be open by September when we would start displaying the quilts, which was very foolish. The first venue I contacted was Plymouth. Working with Lynette Black, the chair of the Howard Kahn Gallery Committee, we arranged for the quilts of Dorothy Burge to be brought to Plymouth. We hoped by late fall. Lynette will tell you a bit more, and she will introduce Dorothy Burge. And by the way, the 7 quilt exhibits, some of which will be shown live later this spring, are called We Are the Story. Lynette?
Hi. When Mariana brought us this opportunity, we were absolutely thrilled. We've been trying to curate exhibitions at Plymouth in support of our church values and our initiatives. And so racial and social justice, environmental justice, welcoming immigrants, homeless, and affordable housing are all issues of high priority for our community. And so this new exhibition that Dorothy Burge has created is just highly valued, and we're going to try to get as much visibility as possible. And so I'd like to welcome Dorothy today as a member of the Women of Color Quilters Network. She's a multimedia artist and a community activist who is inspired by both historic and current social justice issues. She's one of the strongest voices in Chicago for police accountability and reparations for survival of police torture. And so Dorothy is our featured guest today for our Zoom Let's Talk About Race Relations and Conversations. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. So I think I'm going to start by just going to the PowerPoint presentation that I created. And so if we go to the first slide, these are my ancestors. And the lady in the pink is my mother. The one next to her is my grandmother. The one on the top is my great-grandmother. And the one on the bottom is my great-great-grandmother. I was very fortunate that I got to know my grandmother and my great-grandmother. I did not know my great-great-grandmother, but they were all quilters. And so on my mother's side of the family, we come from a long line of quilters. We also come from a line of quilters on my father's side. My father's side of the family, my grandmother actually created a series of just created hand-done quilts, hand-sewn quilts for every person in my family. And there were 7 of us. There are 4 boys and 3 girls. And we all had hand-sewn quilts created by her. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and the activism and what inspires me to do the work. And so I want to start by talking about this particular photo that you're seeing. And this is actually a man who survived a lynching. And his name is James Cameron. And James Cameron is from Marion, Indiana. He was born in 1914, and he survived a lynching when he was 16. And the story is that he was out with two of his friends, and the friends decided that they were going to rob a white man and woman. And he decided he did not want to have anything to do with it, so he ran off. The friends did actually rob the man and woman. The man was actually killed in the robbery. And so a lynch mob of between 12,000 and 15,000 people showed up at the jail, pulled all three of them out of the jail, and put nooses around their neck and strung them all up. And so two of them died. James Cameron actually survived. He was actually cut down before he died. I had the incredible pleasure of meeting with James Cameron because uh, he went on to become an activist, and he is the founder of many chapters of the NAACP and also the founder of the Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee. And so when my daughter was in 8th grade, we took a trip to Milwaukee to go to the Black Holocaust Museum. And he happened to be there that day. And he told us the story of what happened to him. And you could still see the scars that were on his neck. And it just really, really impacted me. And it's something that I never forgot. And so in the year 2008, if we look at the next slide, they had an exhibition called the Citizens Picnic at the DuSable Museum of African American History. And they asked me if I would create something to go into the exhibition. And so I was so moved by James Cameron that I took a photo of him and created this quilt of him as a survivor of a lynching. And so if you look at the quilt, you will see that there are patches on the quilt in the bottom right-hand corner. And those patches were to educate the youth who came in to see the exhibit who didn't know who James Cameron was, and gave you some vital information about who he was and what he went through in his life. The symbol that you see in the actual quilted portrait of him is an Ndinkra symbol from West Africa that means God is all powerful. So on my next slide, I was doing mostly quilts for my home because I wanted art for my home. And then a young man by the name of Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012 by a member of the Neighborhood Watch in Florida. And he was not charged because he used the stand your ground law as his defense. And so there were protests all over the country about what happened to him and the fact that there was no justice being done because he had not been charged in any way for the actual killing of Trayvon Martin. And I made this particular banner that you see on the left-hand side that I used to protest when I went out to do the protests that were happening in Chicago. The story behind this quilt is really kind of interesting because the first protest that I went to, it was called Hoodies Up Day, and I did not own a hoodie. And so as I looked around my house, I found a hoodie that my nephew, who was in college at the time, had left. And so I put on the hoodie and I went downtown to the protest, and I stopped and got Skittles and iced tea. And that's what I used when I protested. I carried the Skittles and I carried a can of the iced tea. And as I was protesting, I could smell my nephew. And the more I marched, the more emotional it became for me, to the point that I was in tears thinking about this could have been him. And so we did a Hoodies Up Day at my church. And this is another relative. It is my great nephew, and we gave him Skittles and iced tea that he held for about 30 seconds so that we could get the photo. Then he kept tossing them out and tossing them in different directions. And so I took this photo and I created this banner that you see on the left that I used to uh, when I was protesting. And if we look at the next slide, what happened with this quilt is that I had created the quilt that you saw, and I met Dr. Carolyn Maslumi, who is the founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network. And Dr. Maslumi was giving a talk at the DuSable Museum because she had just opened an exhibit which was about the election of Barack Obama, and it had been created by women of color quilters from all around the world. And I met Dr. Maslumi there, and I asked her, I said, do you ever take quilts from just people who are not part of the Women of Color Quilters Network, but who have quilts that they think might be of interest? And she said to me, if you will just send me the quilts. She gave me her card. I sent her the quilts. I packed them up, and she called me and she critiqued each quilt one by one and gave me really good instruction on how I could move from just creating these as banners to actually becoming a quilter who could be part of exhibitions. And so she continues to mentor me to this day. She is a mentor and friend, and I just really thank her for her guidance over the years. So I taught at a program that was an experiential program where students came from 14 small liberal arts colleges to Chicago to learn about Chicago neighborhoods and urban issues. And the colleges were from throughout the Midwest. However, there was Carleton College, which is also in Minnesota. There was St. Olaf College, and there was just a number of colleges where the students came, all small liberal arts colleges. And this is actually, I taught at this program for 26 years. This is actually a photo of the students in my human rights and social justice class meeting with a survivor of torture, police torture that happened under the reign of a police commander by the name of John Burge. Also in the class So the next slide is actually Mark Clemens and David Bates. Both of these were torture survivors. They were both tortured by a police commander by the name of John Burge, who was on the police force from 1971 to 1991, and he tortured over 100 African-American men and women, and it took that long to get him off of the police force. Many people were convicted who were innocent. These are two people who were wrongfully convicted, who served over 2 decades in prison, who came out, who became activists, and who are still involved in the fight for social justice. This is another photo also of survivors of police torture, and Anthony Holmes, who is on the board of the Chicago Torture Justice Center in Chicago. And the Torture Justice Center is part of the reparations package that we won in 2016. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of go through the other slides. The other person that you're looking at is Daryl Cannon, also a torture survivor, both innocent, both tortured into false confessions. The woman there is Joey Mogul. an attorney from the People's Law Office, also a great advocate on behalf of survivors of police torture. So we were doing a campaign to fight for reparations in the city of Chicago because we wanted the people who had been tortured by John Burge to be acknowledged, and for there to be an apology, and for them to receive financial compensation. And so there was a lot of activism that happened where we were fighting for reparations. And so in the slide that you just saw was when the young activists decided to stage what they called a die-in. We went to City Hall in Chicago, and we were in uniform, and our uniforms were wearing the t-shirts that had the Chicago flag on it, where we added an extra star, and the star, the black star, symbolized the torture that happened in the city of Chicago. The activists, the young activists, as you will see in the next slide, took the fight for reparations to a different level. And so there were lots of protests and lots of social media events, and they were just really incredible in how they used the skills and talents that they had to fight for reparations, and brought incredible new energy into this movement that had been going on for decades. Here I am, and I am testifying at City Council for the reparations ordinance, talking about the impact that police torture had, especially on the African American community, and how we felt that even though John Burge was eventually brought to trial and eventually convicted, the fact that he only received a 4-year sentence was not justice to us. And so we began to use a more restorative justice approach, and that fueled our fight for reparations. And so I am testifying here, asking City Council to pass the reparations ordinance, and talking about why this was really important to me as an African American woman, why it was important to the African American community. And many people testified that day. The survivors testified that day. The attorneys testified that day. And so it was a really powerful day in City Council. And in 2016, we were finally granted reparations, and we are the first city in the country where reparations have been granted to African Americans. And so we honor all of the activism that happened, and we are now continuing to fight for all of the things that they promised us that would happen in the reparations ordinance, but have not been delivered yet. So even though this happened in 2016, our struggle still continues to make the city live up to what they promised us in the ordinance. These are two activists that I am documenting right now. I am documenting the fight for reparations, and these two activists on the left is the attorney by the name of Stan Willis, and Stan Willis was also initially with the People's Law Office, and then had his own practice and continues to have his own practice. And he is the founder of several organizations that fought for reparations in the African American community throughout the years, over decades of work. I first became involved after I met Stan in 1991. And so Stan had a vision of getting John Burge brought to justice, and through his hard work and the hard work of many other attorneys, we finally made it happen. So Stan created the committee to free Mumia and Aaron Patterson, who were on death row. And then later he created Blacks Against Police Torture, an organization that still is in existence and still fighting to end police torture in the city of Chicago. The person on the right is a woman by the name of Patricia Hill. And Patricia Hill is an incredible woman and activist who was on the Chicago police force. She was the head of the African American Police League for years and was one of the key members in Blacks Against Police Torture, and was an Olympic athlete at one time, and actually worked with Blacks Against Police Torture as we fought the Olympics coming to the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago had made a bid to bring the Olympics to Chicago, and Pat Hill reached out to John Carlos from the 1968 Olympics, and he came to Chicago to be part of the protest against the Olympics coming to Chicago, because Chicago was the torture capital of the country at that point. I also did banners, and this is a banner that I did after Charlottesville. And when people came out to protest with the tiki torches, and when the then president said that there were good people on both sides. And so I created this banner as a means of protest, and it became part of an exhibit on pushing back against what was happening in the country. And this is a quilt of one of my great nieces holding the sign in protest of what happened in Charlottesville. I also created this quilt, Black Lives Matter, and it is also part of the exhibition called And Still She Persists. And it was really when we went out to protest against what was happening under the reign of Donald Trump. This is an exhibit called Freedom Dreams. And the woman that you see sitting is actually sitting on her walker, and she is Amanda Shackelford, and her son is one of the survivors of police torture that happened under John Burge. He is one of 26 Burge survivors who are still incarcerated, we are fighting to get out of prison. So Freedom Dreams was an exhibition where people in the prisons created different stories, different poems, and partnered with artists on the outside to create an art piece that spoke to what they wanted us to create. And so this particular quilt was done to honor Amanda Shackelford, and because her son actually sent out a document that he called a letter to the First Lady. The First Lady that I ever set my eyes on is my beloved mother, the one who carried me for 9 months in her small body and has held me my whole life. Miss Amanda Shackelford, she is only 5'2" in stature, with a voice like a 6-foot giant. She walks the earth, challenging injustice at every level. I've watched her battle the bullies of corruption in Chicago's judicial system. The First Lady stood up against the torture commission machine, the political monster of the Windy City. She tangles with people who set the law of the land and wins them over. I see where I get my toughness. You would think my toughness came from my father's genes, but my mother is as strong as any man who walks the earth. I love my mommy because it seems a pair of her shoes won't last too long. Most people bust open the sides of their shoes, but she wears the heels and soles out due to the miles that she has walked for her child and others' freedom. And so, what I learned in doing this is that the only photos that she had of her son were old Polaroids, as you can see, that are hanging right by the quilt. And uh, if you were sentenced to life in prison without possibility as of parole when you were a minor, you are not allowed to be photographed. And so these are the only photographs that she had of her son. So I took the photograph and I was not able to even make out the facial features. So I created this quilt to honor her and to honor him and the written piece that he had created. I only read part of it. The piece is actually about 2 pages long. And the next quilt, you see that part of the reparations package that we received is that the city agreed to create a center for torture survivors where they could go and receive mental health counseling and other services that were needed in order for them to have a healthy life. And so Amanda Shackelford donated this quilt to the Chicago Torture Justice Center, and it sits in the center to this day where the survivors of police torture meet. I also did a series of quilts that were about human rights and social justice issues. This is one of my great nephews, and he is wearing a t-shirt that says he matters. And surprisingly enough, this quilt was done in 2016, and we're still trying to raise awareness and get people to realize that Black lives matter. The next quilt is a different great nephew, and he is holding a sign. And the sign that he is holding, if we go back one slide, the slide that he is holding is about the fact that many African American youth are being killed through gun violence and police violence. And so this quilt speaks to both of those issues. Stop killing us. Young African Americans have the right to life in this country. And so I created this quilt because I really wanted to bring awareness about the number of young Black African Americans in this country who are being killed by the police and being killed because of gun violence. So this is a quilt about Centoya Brown, and Centoya Brown was sentenced to serve over 30 years in prison. She was a survivor of sex trafficking, and she killed someone who had actually bought her for sex. And she said that she feared for her life, and that was not believed. At the time, she was 16, and the person who she killed was actually in his 40s. And so she received this sentence, and while she was in prison, she became self-educated, became a mentor to other people, and there was a huge fight to free her because she had been a victim of sex trafficking, and she is now free. This is Eric Blackman. Eric Blackman is a quilt that I did that is actually 10 feet tall. uh, where I wanted to raise awareness about the issue of wrongful convictions. And so Eric Blackman is also an incredible poet, spoken word artist. He went in prison when he was 19 years old. He served 16 years, and for a crime he did not commit. He became a paralegal while he was incarcerated and filed his own legal briefs and motions and got himself out of prison because attorneys would not take his case. So he created this poem, which you see on the right side of the screen. And I just want to read a little bit of it, where he says, 15 years, 7 months, 4 weeks, 1 day, 16 hours and 33 minutes to be exact. 5,724 dreadful days, 137,416 and a half hours, 8,244,993 miserable minutes, and I won't forget a second of it. I missed 66 of my kids' birthdays, 337 holidays, 16 vacations, 14 graduations, 11 funerals, first steps, first words, all of my 20s, half of my 30s, most of my life. I lost everything, every dime I had, 4 appeals, friends, family, my fiance, my relationship with my kids. At times I lost faith. Other times I lost hope. A few times I even lost myself, but I survived. I survived the conditions. I survived the honorary, tyrannical officers, some wolfish, vulturous inmates, a stabbing, being jumped, 2 black eyes, 2 busted lips, 1 chipped tooth, a busted head, 6 stitches, 1 broken nose, 1 fractured arm, 1 concussion, the suffering, the pain, the loss, but I overcame. I endured by never hearing, never seeing, never speaking, never caring, never feeling, never loving, never resting, never giving up. For 15 years, 7 months, 4 weeks, 1 day, 16 hours and 33 minutes to be exact. And I can't forget a second of it, all for a crime I didn't commit, but who's counting? And so I just really wanted to do this quilt so that people would be aware of what happens when you are incarcerated, and also to raise the issue about wrongful convictions that are happening. This is another person who I have done a quilt about, and the person that you're seeing on the left side of the screen is a woman by the name of Alice Kim. And Alice Kim has been an activist for decades. She started working with the campaign in the death penalty in Illinois, and is now the head of the Human Rights Center at the University of Chicago. And she was part of a campaign where we were trying to get people who had been sentenced to life without possibility of parole to raise awareness about this issue. And so one of the signs that she is holding is talking about the fact that without your help, Ronaldo Hudson will die in prison. And Ronaldo Hudson has just a very, very incredible story, and one that is just really heartbreaking. Here's a man who went through incredible trauma as a kid. He was someone who had parents who were addicted to drugs, and because of this, he was actually moved from one family member's home to another throughout his life. He was on drugs at the age of 19, and he went into a man's home to rob him, and he actually killed this man in his apartment. He was sentenced to death, and he was part of the people who were on death row. when Governor George Ryan in Illinois ended the death penalty, his sentence was then commuted to life without possibility of parole. Well, Ronaldo had been a model prisoner for decades. He went back to school, got educated. When he went into prison, he was illiterate. He was not able to read or write. He had this horrific childhood that I talked about. He was a victim of child abuse. He had a twin brother who fell or was pushed down a flight of steps when he was 7 and died. At the age of 15, Ronaldo's he never received any kind of services, even though he went through all of this trauma. And so I think it's important that I raise the issue that we need to get services for youth who are experiencing trauma so that they won't have to end up in a life of crime. So he was on death row, and during his time in prison, he found God, and he talks about this all the time, and that how after finding God, he became a mentor. He is now a minister. He was released in September and is doing incredible restorative justice work throughout the city of Chicago, and just really, really proud of him and the work that he's doing. This is a quilt that I just completed, and it's a thousand African-American women and girls are missing in this country, and it doesn't seem to even be an issue. These are my 2 latest quilts that I just completed, and these quilts are about the death of George Floyd and the fact that the police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes. All the time what he was saying, he couldn't breathe. He was calling for his mother, and just the inhumaneness of what happened. And so I have great nieces and nephews who were actually protesting in front of their home because of COVID. If you can see in the quilt, they're actually wearing masks at the time. And they were on their knees with their hands on their throat saying, "I can't breathe." And people in the neighborhood drove by and they were honking their horns in support. And so this is my great niece, who also told me, by the way, when I finished this quilt, that her favorite color was pink and not purple, and that I should have put her in pink. So I will know if I do a quilt of her in the future to actually put her in pink. And so that is the end of the PowerPoint, and I am very open to taking any questions or hearing any comments that you might have.
I saw
Dorothy.
one. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Rebecca. Sorry.
Go for it. Dorothy, thank you. To this point, there is one question. Asking if you can tell us about the symbol used on the Black Lives Matter banner.
That symbol is also the same symbol that I used when I did the quilt of James Cameron, the survivor of the lynching. And that is called Jinyame, it is an Ndinkra symbol from West Africa, and it means God is all powerful or fear only God.
So there've been several comments in appreciation. Your quilts are such powerful images adding to your words. You said you've made them into protest banners. Can we buy them?
I have not actually created them into banners yet. It is something I just retired after 26 years of teaching this year. And so I am now trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my quilts in order to kind of get them out there. And one of the things that I am thinking about is turning them into banners and also creating a series of postcards. So those are things that I have on my agenda to do within the next year.
Has the situation in Chicago improved at all since the removal of Officer Burge?
We continue to have people who are tortured by the police in the city of Chicago, and it continues to be an ongoing fight because we have the Chicago Torture Justice Center, which is part of the reparations package. We are now getting people who will come to the center and say what has happened to them, or who will say what has happened to their loved ones. One of the things that the center did recently is they created a support group for mothers who have lost their children because of police violence. And so this support group is very, very active now. I want to say that the reparations ordinance promised us several things. They promised us a formal apology, which they gave us. They promised us that they would fund a center for the survivors of the torture so that they could go and receive mental health counseling and other social service counseling. They are now saying to us that funding for the center is running out, and they are fighting not to continue to fund the center. So this is an ongoing struggle. Part of the reparations package also was that they were to teach about the police torture that happened under the reign of John Burge in 8th grades and in 10th grades in all Chicago public schools. So a curriculum was created, and we are fighting to make sure that that curriculum is still being taught. The major thing that has not happened, which was part of the reparations packet, was that we were supposed to have a memorial that honored the survivors of John Burge and the torture. We were supposed to have a memorial built that would be funded by the city. That is an ongoing fight that we are having right now. And we continue because we are going to have that memorial built, and we are going to honor those folks who are the survivors of the torture.
So a couple of people have raised their hands. This one, I'm not sure if it's John Carnes, it might be Sonia, but I'm gonna have her or him talk, and then you can unmute now and ask your question.
It's John.
Okay, great, John. Thank you.
I'm on the Textile Center board as well. In fact, Mariana and I went on the board at the same time. It's fascinating to understand. When I look at quilts now, I think of stories. And I don't know that I would have thought of that before I really got to know what textile art is and what what quilts are. So I just found your whole presentation to be fascinating. I've also seen a number of Carolyn Maslumi's quilts. And so now when I look at a quilt, I'm thinking, what is the story? It was just marvelous to see the way you told your story with quilts.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that was passed down is actually through our oral history. And so I grew up in a time when there wasn't a lot of television watching, and there were no computers or social media. So a lot of our history was passed orally. And so to me, this is my way to pass what is happening in my family, in the African-American community, through quilts. And these quilts, I hope, will continue to be passed through generations and live on to tell the story of what's happening.
And here's Bill and Barbara Reed. You can unmute your mic.
Yeah, this may have been addressed online on the Plymouth site or earlier in this discussion, but I didn't hear it referenced. The actual artistry of these quilts that Dorothy created, I assume many of you already know that they're on display at MIA, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. But if you're not aware of that, I would strongly encourage you to actually see them in person. It's amazing how they were pieced together, and you can't get that, of course, from the two-dimensional, nonetheless beautiful pictures that we've seen during this presentation. But the artistry is just really amazing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the fact that you were able to go and see the quilts in person. And I have to say that the Women of Color Quilters Network have taken quilting to me to a different level. Dr. Carolyn Maslumi is an incredible quilter herself, an incredible artist. We use different forms of quilting. So there are traditional quilts that are part of the Women of Color Quilters Network. There are improvisational quilts like the quilts that the Quilters of G's Bend are known for. And there are many people who are using quilts as a tool to document history, to inspire action, and to tell the story of what's happening.
So there's more questions than we have time for. So I'm going to wrap a couple of them together. And this is, what keeps you going? Making quilts takes so much energy, as does fighting the system. And then there's another question: in what ways has this amazing project and work changed your own life?
What keeps me going is that, to me, quilting is a way for me to heal. And because I do a lot of activism, when you come home from very difficult negotiations, when you come home from protests, you just need a way to sit, to think, to reflect, and to do some self-care. And to me, quilting has been a way that I do self-care. And so it's something that is really important to me. It gives me peace, and that's why I continue to do it. There are some subject matters that I cannot do. I do have sketches of quilts that I would like to do, but right now they're way too emotional for me to do. And so one is on George Floyd in the murder, and I have just not been strong enough to actually do that quilt as of yet. And the one quilt away. And so it has been very difficult for me to do the quilt of her, because I really want to honor her, and I really want to show the beauty and the strength that she has. And every time I begin the quilt, I just think it's just not good enough. So I have not been able to do that yet.
Well, Dorothy, thank you so much. I feel so privileged that we get to hear you speak and talk about your work. And I encourage everyone to, if they haven't seen it, to see it up front and close. And so you can see the artistry as well as the stories.
Thank you so much for having me. And I wish you all a great day, and I wish you all peace and blessings.
Back at you 100-fold. I want to also remind everyone that today at 12:30 on Zoom, there will be a discussion of the film The River and the Wall. And I'm sure that the information is in the Friday email, but it's at 12:30 today. For people that have seen the film previously, the documentary. And then next Sunday at 9:30, the organizers of the Academia of Elves that's in Plymouth Church will be speaking, Karina Elves and Karen Eustace. So I hope you can join us then. Dorothy, thank you again.
Thank
It's been a
you.
pleasure.